couple of housekeeping rules. You will be all muted, but if you somehow unmute yourself, please mute yourself, because this is our guests' opportunity to tell us some interesting reflections, and we need to make sure that everybody is muted so that we have a good sound quality and so everybody can hear. There will be an opportunity at the end of Larry's lecture to ask some questions. I'd like them to be put in the chat, and that way we can sort of see what they are, and for a few minutes we'll see if we can get some response from him about some of the questions you might have. But thank you, everybody, for attending yet another of our speaker series brought to you by the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania Project. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm the founder and president of the Phil Simon Clinic Tanzania Project, and we are just delighted that we're continuing to grow our audience and have some really wonderful speakers. Next month will be Dr. William Pastert, who is a climatologist from JPL, and he will be discussing the climate issues that are currently affecting all of us. I believe that date is March 22nd, but you can go to our website and get the actual date. In April, we are heading towards having Dr. Jane Goodall. We don't know the date yet, but she has agreed to do it. So that will give you those dates, and the dates further down the road. We're booked actually all the way till September with some really interesting speakers and discussing all kinds of things from novel equipment to be used in underserved countries to the importance of One Health and participation of all different types of professionals in understanding infectious diseases. So without further ado, I want to tell you a little bit about our speaker tonight. We are just so honored to have Larry Mantle. As many of you know, you probably know him, have heard his fabulous show, but I'll give you a little bit of background on him. I listened to him for many years before became a little bit of a part of the show, and it's really been a wonderful experience to do it and to have an opportunity to speak about important health issues, but also to get to know Larry, who's just an extraordinary person. He is a native Californian. He was born in Inglewood and grew up in Hollywood. He attended Hollywood High School. He has a BA in psychology from Vanguard University. Most of you know him as the host of what was KPCC, now LAist 89.3 AirTalk. AirTalk has been in existence since 1985 and is really the flagship of the KPCC/LAist radio station now. Larry has created a wonderful opportunity for many topics to be discussed in his show, which he does with great ease. Just as an example, last week he had one show that I was listening to that he discussed Gustavo Dudamel's departure to the New York Philharmonic. That was followed by a fascinating, excellent interview with Mayor Karen Bass about unhoused individuals and what to do about the crisis of unhoused people, a thing on artificial intelligence, and then finishing up with a story about a book about how to apologize, where the word boogers was used, apparently the first time on radio. So, but he can toggle back and forth from many topics and speak with great wisdom, and is also a very inviting speaker to those guests who come on his show. As you know, I know him now from our team member of the COVID sort of COVID information service on KPCC LAist, and I've been allowed to work with many other distinguished physicians and healthcare workers in helping all of us navigate this pandemic that we are still moving through. Larry has won the Professional Journalist Award and is probably the most prestigious award, the Mark Twain Award for journalism, and it's just a delight to have him here tonight. He's going to discuss how the impact of political and other kinds of factors influence people's listening and how that may influence their lives going forward. And we're going to kind of use that as a starting point, and then he can take it where he wants to. So please welcome Larry Mantle.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schreiner. It's just a pleasure to be here. I appreciate it so much. And it's wonderful to have the role reversal here, where you're going to be asking some questions of me, and then others of you who are on the program tonight will have a chance to ask questions of me as well. First of all, I can't thank you enough, Dr. Schreiner, because what you've done for public health and for clarity and accuracy about COVID-19, about vaccinations, about testing, about personal practices around COVID-19 has been invaluable. I can't tell you how many of our listeners have told me that those segments that we did throughout the 3 years when the pandemic was at its prime, that people, built their days in many cases around listening to those segments. And we had a wonderful team of physicians that we continue to call on, most prominently being yourself, Dr. Schreiner, but other outstanding physicians that we've included as well. And it so perfectly fits with the mission of what we do at LAist 89.3 and generally in public broadcasting. That is to take an issue that we're deeply concerned about which there's not just curiosity, but in the case of COVID-19, tremendous fear. So many people with vulnerabilities to COVID-19 wanting to know, well, what are the trade-offs? What do I have to give up in my daily life to be able to help protect myself? And at what point do I potentially go too far and cut out activities that would actually benefit my mental and physical health that maybe I shouldn't forego to have perfect safety from COVID-19? And I think for so many of us, it's like so many things in life, it's that trade-off. It's how do we manage the individual risk we're willing to take on, or that is an acceptable risk given whatever our conditions are, to be able to live a life that balances these things. And that's much of what we do on AirTalk every day, whether we're talking about, as we did today, the LAist city power plant, that's the largest power plant that the council voted unanimously to switch to a hydrogen powered plant instead of natural gas. And you might think the environmental community would say, that's wonderful. That's great. Hydrogen is a clean fuel, and natural gas, while cleaner than coal, of course, isn't clean. It's a fossil fuel with CO2 emissions, which exacerbates the warming of the climate. But we had someone on from the Sierra Club today who explained that there are actually nitrous oxide emissions that are higher from hydrogen power plants, at least with the current technology, and how that hydrogen is created from water, that actually make the risks for people living around the power plant greater than they are from a natural gas power plant. So you have a larger scale climate benefit from the hydrogen plant, our Sierra Club guest was arguing, but for the people that actually live nearby, they're taking on a greater risk. And of course, often these power plants are in more working class communities where there are a variety of health implications from the industry, from freeways, from various kinds of plants that are there, refineries and the like, that they're already disproportionately experiencing. So what I love is being able to talk about these things that are very nuanced. There aren't that many things that we talk about that are really just black or white issues. Those things are sort of decided. We make public policy about it, we move on. But really where the friction is, the things that we're talking about involve what trade-offs are we willing to take. I use another climate example. We know the climate benefit of solar power arrays and what they can provide in renewable energy, or with wind turbines and what they're able to produce. But there are trade-offs with each of those, including solar arrays that are done at scale in the desert, where desert lands that are habitat for a variety of different species end up being compromised for the solar arrays. Similarly, with the wind-generated power, birds are often killed as a result of that. And you have the natural terrain that so many of us love about the desert, which looks very differently with huge pole after huge pole with a wind turbine on it. So these things are all things that we're grappling with societally. What are we willing to give up to get something else that we agree that we need? And that's what I love talking about. So back to COVID, Dr. Schreiner, I so appreciate your willingness to come on and to talk about the things that we haven't known, that really, studies were being done, but we didn't have answers yet. And that frustrated our listeners so much because we all, of course, want certainty. We want to know, to what degree of risk are we exposing ourselves? To what extent is a particular remedy going to help us? To what extent is the vaccine that's currently available going to provide protection, and in what ways not? And with COVID-19, with much of medicine, it's not all science. There's art that's involved. There's uncertainty and ongoing searches to try and come up with double-blind, statistically valid examples, and it's not always there.
Yeah, that's for sure. That's why we call it the practice of medicine, Larry. It's because we haven't perfected it yet, and I don't think we ever will. Tell us about how you became interested in journalism, and a little bit about your journey as you kind of developed your career. You talked to me about it one time, and it was really fascinating. I think the listeners would be interested in what you have to say.
Thanks. I actually grew up loving radio as an only child, and though close to my parents, I'm still close with both of them. Radio was a companion for me. And so I had radio on a lot. That intimacy that we talk about in radio, that sense that you're right there with the person speaking on the radio, was very powerful for me as a kid. So much so that my sorts of obsessive personality with radio led me to memorize the air personalities on all the major LA radio stations. I could tell you who came on at what time, and I knew what their personalities were, the kinds of things, whether they played music or whether it was talk radio on what was the dominant station when I was a kid, KPCC 790 in LA. So I was immersed in radio and I loved it. And I loved sports too, and was excited about the potential that maybe I could be a sports announcer or a newscaster or a talk show host. But as I got older and spending my middle school and high school years in Hollywood, where the radio stations were at the time, I was able to go in and talk with people. Just as a kid, I was able, hey, can I talk to someone about radio? And they were great. And I still get people who approach me similarly wanting to know about careers in radio. But as a kid, I talked with the professionals in the business, and they discouraged me in many ways. They said, oh, you're going to have to go to a tiny, market. You'll have to work your way up. The odds you'll get back to LA aren't that great. There's just a handful of big stars in radio. They make big money. Everybody else makes minimum wage. It's a very low paid and very transient kind of a job, moving from place to place. And that discouraged me. There wasn't public radio at that time, of course. It was all commercial broadcasting. So as time went on, I'm a person of faith, and I decided that I was going to train for the ministry. I was a biblical studies major first in college, but I realized I didn't have the interest in biblical studies at the level of depth that I needed for that. I switched to psychology, which I've always loved, got my degree in that, but nevertheless, I was going to pursue ministry afterwards. I started at seminary and realized, no, I don't have the calling. And I love radio so much, I'm just going to pursue it. And I was living in Pasadena. I called up KPCC cold and I said, do you have opportunities for people to volunteer? And they said, well, you have to enroll for a class at PCC. And then I said, okay, I can do that, even though I have my degree. I came in and took a writing test that day. And they said, oh, you write well. And, when do you want to come in? I said, I'll come back tomorrow. They put me on the air a couple of days later, and that never stopped. I continued at KPCC for a couple of years. I was the host of Morning Edition, and KPCC went through one of its serious funding crises. And they weren't able to pay me to host Morning Edition anymore, and I needed to work. So I called up a radio station in Riverside, a CBS affiliate that I knew had a lot of people who came to Los Angeles from that station. And for those of you that are baseball fans, it was the equivalent of what's called AAA minor league baseball, that level right below the majors. And I thought it would be a very good place for me to go get more experience and do some commercial radio. I called up. They said, we just fired the news director today. How soon can you get here for an interview? I can't believe the serendipity. I said, well, I'm in Pasadena. Let me put a suit on. Let me get my reel, my what I sound like on the radio. I can be there in about an hour, 15 minutes. Fine, come on down. I went in and I did a reading of news copy from the Associated Press, cold reading. You didn't want to hear my reel. You wanted to see, how do you read news? And I gave what was probably the best reading I don't think I've ever matched that in my career. It was just like, the spotlight comes on, and it was just like someone who'd been working in the business for years, even though I hadn't. So they thought I was better than I was, but immediately the program director took me in to talk with the general manager, said, we need to hire these guys. He's good. And I started the following Monday. Short time after there, months later, KPCC called and said, we have an opening for news director and we'd like to hire you. And I said, I'd love to come back to the Los Angeles market. And that was in 1983. 2 years later, I was asked by our general manager as we were walking out to the car together. He said, I really like how you sound on air. Is there something you'd like to do that's more personality oriented than doing news throughout the day? And I said, well, I'm glad you asked. I'd love to do a call-in show. We have these brilliant listeners, so many different topics in the news that we could talk about. I'd like to do that. Now, this was at a time in public broadcasting where that was really frowned on, because the idea is if you can talk with professors and elected officials and experts, why would you talk with just regular people of the public? There's kind of an elitist view of it. But our general manager said, I love that idea. When can you start? And I said, well, we need to get the technical, the phone lines in and all. I'll get back to you when I talk with our chief engineer. We launched it about 2 weeks later. It was April 1st, 1985, the first AirTalk. And now coming up on, it'll be our 38th year anniversary, April 1st of this year. It's the longest daily talk show continuously running in the history of Los Angeles. And when I was that kid at Hollywood High School, I would have never guessed that I would end up in radio and have what has been a 40-year career overall, 42-year career overall, and nearly 38 years of AirTalk. So that's my journey.
It's an amazing one. And you and I were talking the other day about how, in spite of the appeal of social media and the ease with which people toggle back and forth on their computers or their televisions or their smartphones, that radio has really still become a very important way of communicating for people. And then, of course, the advent of the podcast, which is an interesting topic, has really ramped brought radio to the forefront again. And how do you think the way you do the show or your audiences, how has that changed over the last many decades that you've been doing this?
It's changed dramatically because social media gives us another way to get feedback from listeners. So Twitter is a way that people connect with us. Facebook comments as well that we're able to use in the program. And we also have an email address that many people use with their comments or their questions for our guests. So all of this has changed the program dramatically because it's not just people who are able to call. Remember when I started the program, the people that were calling in were generally at home or still at the office listening before they left, because car phones were really, cell phones were not a thing. We didn't have the internet. I started producing the show myself by, subscribing to a bunch of newspapers. And that was really the source, plus our wire services for information. So with having the internet and with having all these other forms of social media, it's dramatically changed the program. But the other side, and one of the things that I was hoping later we could talk about is It really, and I'm not obviously the first one or the first 1,000th person to say this, but it has enabled people to move into echo chambers where they're comforted by hearing people who see the world the same way they do, with their same biases, with their same emotional response to things. And it's made it much more difficult because it's caused people to sort themselves. And it's much harder to bring people of different perspectives together. It's something that I still am very devoted to and try to create on the program that I do, a place of different worldviews, different perspectives, different views about life, and different values can come together and talk about these things in a way that people can, it's not that people are unchallenged, because they can certainly hear other people's challenge to it respectfully, but it's a place where people are not going to be personally insulted, where ad hominem sorts of attacks are going to be identified, and it's my job as a host to push back on that. And to create a place where we can have a civilized conversation and we can disagree and even try and come to some agreed upon facts, or at least agree upon the facts on which we disagree. And that's increasingly difficult in the world in which we live. And I do think that people are looking for a form of emotional comfort in the information that they pursue, which isn't always the healthiest thing for us. It's part of my job to consume media from across the spectrum, and I do that. I think it's absolutely essential. If I don't know what people are talking about, what their concerns are, what they're saying about people that view the world differently than them, I'm not really doing my job as the host of the program. But social media has played a huge role in it.
Yeah, I think sort of digging down a little bit deeper in that, Larry, is how NPR, I think, thinks of themselves as an equitable, fair-minded venue for news. I mean, there are people that might disagree with that, but I think that's at news and programs and so forth. But it is very inquisitive, educational sort of platform, I would say. But how do you, just in terms of the sort of mechanics for your show, how do you go out and try to get the opposing opinions of things? Because that audience may not be someone who listens to your show.
It's gotten much harder, I have to say. In the last few years, it's much more challenging to get conservative guests to come on the program, because NPR and public radio generally has become more and more perceived as being a voice for the liberal worldview. And I'd say it is challenging in public radio, because most of us that work in it were raised in pretty liberal environments. I didn't go to an elite academic institution, but many of the people that work in public radio do. They come from a particular sector of the population that has a particular view of the world. And so the challenge, I think, for all of us is to not live in an echo chamber, to move beyond that sort of place where we grew up and what we were exposed to and the limitations of that, to live in a bigger world. But in terms of getting guests, as you say, Dr. Schreiner, it's become very, very challenging. So our producers try and stress, look, this program is really about what trade-offs are involved in public policy. If we're going to talk about a fiscal issue, we're not going to leave conservative fiscal worldviews out of that conversation. That doesn't get us anywhere. We're not just going to have liberals talking to each other about how government should spend more. That's not really helpful. It doesn't reflect where the Congress is at. It doesn't reflect where this country is and divided on its views about the role of government in our lives, the role of government spending, which programs should have priority and which ones shouldn't. All of those issues are important ones for us to talk about and to hear those voices. So our producers are really stressing that to our guests, that we are not trying to stack the deck. We do want to hear a range of views, but I have to say it's very challenging.
One of the things that we're blessed with by living in a city like Los Angeles is that it's very multicultural, multinational, a very international city. And the world, as we know, has become a pretty small place. I think if COVID showed us one thing, it's that, a small little virus can basically bring humanity, to a halt for a little while we're trying to figure out what's happening to us. And it's sort of a great unifier in some ways. It had produced other problems, of course, in terms of divisiveness, but in terms of reaching out and to discussing global issues and getting the audience in Southern California to address it, how do you go about sort of broadening the horizon? You do a fabulous job of focusing on things that are related to this area and to global things, and how do you kind of toggle that back and forth so that listeners can relate to that?
That's a wonderful question, Dr. Schreiner, and let me get to that by describing when a producer or a news apprentice or an intern comes onto our team, one of the first things I do is explain what are the three things that make a segment for AirTalk, and that gets to your question. So one is, it's happening right now. It's breaking news. The United States has just agreed it's going to supply tanks to Ukraine to defend itself against Russia. It's happening right now. A mass shooting event is occurring. Our listeners want to know what are the details, what's going on. The second issue is that whatever the issue is lends itself to depth. Our segments can be even longer than what you hear on the NPR show's Morning Edition and All Things Considered. Our hours are totally flexible. If we want to devote an hour to capital punishment and hear from an array of voices, we can do that. We're not bound. We could spend 2 hours if we felt that there was enough there that we really needed to grapple with. So that kind of freedom to go very deep is a second aspect of the show that comes into play with what we do. The third is that there's a listener component with listeners sharing their experiences or their particular view that really adds something to the program. So when it comes to international coverage like you're describing, we have, as you know, so many communities here that are the largest community outside of the capital city or the largest city of that listener's country of origin, whether we're talking about South Korea or Iran or Armenia or Mexico. They're just country after country that is highly represented here. So that enables us, when we're talking about the protests in Iran over the morality police and the killing of the young woman over wearing hijab, we can hear, our phone lines are jammed with Iranian Americans who talk about what they're doing to try and support the protesters in Iran, about how this makes them feel, about family members who are there and might be under some degree of risk. What their hope is that this might be a moment in their country's history, that there's a change from the theocratic dictatorship to an open democracy. So we're able to get at the international issues with depth, with what's developing now, and with the voices of people here in Southern California who are still deeply tied to those communities and who have something important to say about it.
Yeah, and I think last week it was, well, certainly was last week, you obviously have access to the NPR journalists that are overseas, and I recall that there was one that was in Turkey right when they were removing a survivor from this just terrible devastation that's happened over there. So how do you sort of, when you because that's a wonderful resource to have all of the NPR sort of international stuff that you can then take back to your show, and as you said, really explore it in a granular level.
It's extraordinary, and our good fortune, and I feel badly saying that, is just such a terrible event that you're describing. Jason Bobian, I believe it was, he had just arrived, excuse me, at that city in Ukraine. I'm sorry, in Turkey, where this huge rescue effort was going on. As he was talking with us, bodies were being removed. And so this had not even gone on NPR yet. It just happened to be the timing of when he agreed to come on and join us on the program. So when they're able to do that, we have tremendous access to those reporters. I remember so well, and unfortunately I can't come up with her name right now, the day that Notre Dame Cathedral caught fire. And the NPR reporter based in Paris, She was grabbing a cab coming up to Notre Dame on her phone with us live. And I have on CNN and so I can see Notre Dame burning, and I'm describing for our listeners as that fire is happening to the NPR reporter who was there. And she said, I can't see it. I'm in the cab coming. She said, thank you, because you're describing what I'm in Paris that I can't see. Then she arrived. Her cab got there. She got out. You can hear live on the radio all the people around. You can hear people sobbing as they're watching Notre Dame go up in flames. And the reporter is describing what she's seeing now as it comes into view, as she moves from the street onto the grounds of the cathedral, and is now able to give us her description of the events. It was an incredibly powerful experience. And no one else that I'm aware of had someone right there that quickly of the U.S. news organizations to be able to provide it. And we had that for our listeners. But it's an incredible resource for us. And the limitation is that those reporters, of course, their first high priority has to be filing their stories for the news magazines, for the national program. NPR is their employer, not us. We're a member station. And so they do their best to accommodate us. But and especially because they love coming on and talking with our listeners. I have to say, NPR reporters tell me, Larry, if we can do it, we're going to do it. We love your listeners. We really value being on AirTalk. So, but obviously the priority is still going to be with the NPR news magazines.
And, they face kind of an interesting dilemma, as you were describing the Notre Dame conflagration there. I was thinking of the one of the more famous radio broadcasts when the Hindenburg went down, and what radio reporters have to do is describe the situation, because it's not like the television folks that can just say, well, look behind me and you can see what's happening, or you have a film crew there, that you have to describe it in words and capture the event that's happening. And that's a different technique, I think, than being a television reporter.
It's totally different, and it's something that I have a lot of experience with. I have done descriptions of pursuits, of mass shootings, of memorial services with things that need to be described that people watching on television could see, but that our listeners couldn't. I've done it with earthquakes, describing damage, with floods, with fires, all of that in the moment. I was on the weekend doing live coverage, one of our major fires. They're all a blur. I can't remember which one. And I was getting calls from listeners that were trapped on a freeway that was closed, and the fire was, burning on the nearby hillside, and they needed to get out. So I was looking on the map, finding what roads were open, and in real time on the radio saying, okay, here's where you need to try and double back, get off here, take this canyon road. It's not closed, I can see right now. That'll get you around to this other free and a workaround. I can't remember, I think it was the 60 they were trapped on the Pomona Freeway. But when you're doing live coverage like that, you really have to just respond, use everything that you have available to you, use the knowledge that you have of the region, whether it's the freeway system and then what's available in real-time traffic, and try and help listeners the best that you can. But it's tremendously challenging. And there are times you have to describe something and in the moment make a decision, how graphic am I going to be? I also have my emotional response to things. There are things I've covered that have affected me very deeply, but I can't stop to react to my emotions on the air. My job is to share the information with the listeners. I can go home and cry about it later, and have, but in the moment, I've got to describe what may be a terrible event and share that with listeners in what I hope is the best way for them to hear it.
We also talked to you earlier this week, you and I, about the other pandemic that I started my career with, which is HIV. And in that arc of 35 to 40 years, how has how has your responsibility as a news purveyor but also as someone who engages with the public, how has that changed? And what is it more open? Can you talk about more topics now than we could back in those days? And could we, there was obviously the same similarity in trying to explain what this pandemic was about, and we wanted people not to be afraid and to access healthcare and so forth. But I think just in my own career, I would certainly say that the accessibility of information during COVID has been different than it was during the HIV pandemic, in part because of how that first started. But just reflect a little bit about those two pandemics, because I know we talked about that.
I think, there are obviously similarities and some differences. And I think, one of the big challenges with HIV and AIDS was that early on, we just didn't have the understanding of it. And so people's fearfulness took the form of stigmatizing individuals at higher risk. And so that created a whole concurrent problem of how people were treated based on their identity, along with HIV/AIDS. It just came loaded with that kind of judgmentalism and the kind of ignorance that we all were experiencing. I use that not in the judgmental term. It did come out in ways that I would judge negatively, but just our lack of knowledge. We didn't understand it. And so I think the thing that was so good is that for our listeners, there was a desire to understand without scapegoating. People were really hungry for knowledge. And so our ability to put people like Dr. Michael Gottlieb and others on very early to talk about what we did know was very, very helpful. And we also early on were hearing from gay men who were listeners to our program talking about friends that they'd lost, about how their lives has been changed as a result of HIV/AIDS. And to give the human dimension of that on the program, I think was incredibly valuable. Again, it was early on a place for people to come to talk about their fears, their concerns, what the impact of this was on their relationships, their sexuality, on their family life, all of that. So we've come a long way in that information is just so much more accessible. And the rate, what was incredible to me about COVID was how we learned things so quickly, how a vaccine was developed so quickly, how we went from the view that, masks were really not all that important for the general public, and they were so vital for healthcare workers, really need to save those for people that were in higher risk healthcare delivery. But then, we sort of pivoted and now we think that with the droplets that can spread COVID-19, we really should be masking as much as possible. We could pivot on that. We could make a change. Now, there were people who said, oh, well, public health people don't know what they're talking about and they're making it up as they go. But I think we did a really good job of explaining this is the best of our knowledge now. And these are the limitations that we're dealing with in the supply chain now. And this is the limitation of the science now. And we're trying to provide the best information given what we know with those caveats. And it just came so much faster than with HIV/AIDS. But I do think the stigma was a different dynamic with HIV/AIDS. And fortunately, we made our way through that, but it was, of course, at great cost to so many people who were at high risk of HIV.
Yes, and I think, as we talked about too, I think, and I said this on the radio several times, is that the legacy of those early years with HIV and organizations like ACT UP and really trying to get to fast track medications and testing has served us well during COVID. That was the groundwork for really a lot of the science and viral technologies that we now have, PCRs, of course, being one of the more important ones. So it's interesting. I'm going to be going to the AIDS meetings next week, and it's an interesting parallel because I think so many HIV providers have had sort of a similar experience. But I think, again, your show is an opportunity for people to gain information in a very open way, but also to express their own personal interaction with whatever might be going on, whether it's a disease or an event, some of the shooting things we've had happen, and the things that are very impactful to all of us. But when you have the individuals who come on, that they themselves have gone through it, I think that's really powerful.
What's amazing to me, Dr. Schreiner, is how so many of our listeners who call in, and we do screen them, so we're not just automatically putting people on, and our call screeners are looking for people who can do this, but they're combining what may be a deeply emotional experience for them with insight, with a perspective or a piece of analysis. So it's not just, here's how I feel about this because I experienced it, but here's now how I think about this thing. And that melding of the intellect with the emotions, I think, is something that makes the program very, very valuable. And that's hard to find in the world. We were talking about that CDC survey of teen girls, which showed this dramatic increase over the past 2 years of a sense of hopelessness and of levels of depression that have, skyrocketed, particularly among girls, much more than in teen boys. And so we had parents calling in talking about daughters that had done self-harm, or that were just in a deep, deep emotional hole, and how hard it was as parents for them to help their daughters through this period. But at the same time, offering a useful insight to another parent who might be going through that same experience. Well, that's gold. That is a beautiful thing. We can't all do that. And I'm amazed at how many of our listeners can be in that place to speak from the brain and to speak from emotional experience.
Well, that certainly also is a testament, though, to your skills as the host. And I think you've really sort of set the bar for, even your guest hosts, is that the receptiveness and the safety that your listeners seem to feel when they call in and ask usually very excellent questions or have really insightful comments. In the New York Times today, there was a big article about sort of the fate of podcasts and where they might be going. That I guess there's some of the financial aspects of podcasters are beginning to take a little dip. Where do you think radio is going to go, or that kind of platform is going to go in the next 10 or 20 years?
I think it's going to be fascinating. I'm not surprised with all the venture capital that went into podcasting and all the acquisitions of different podcast production studios. I mean, huge amounts of money went into it. And I'm not surprised that now, as some of the challenges of monetizing podcasts and the glut of podcasts have presented themselves, that money is starting to retreat a bit. I think that's a natural phenomenon. But what podcasting provides is an opportunity for so many voices to be heard at very low cost. People that would never have an opportunity to be on a radio station now have a chance to tell their stories in a way that may be as simple as them just talking to podcast listeners into a microphone, or ones that use very advanced production values to do storytelling in very creative and new ways, in ways that would be very difficult for us on our budget for AirTalk, which is an expensive show because there's a lot of labor, a lot of people that work on it. But compared to what a high budget podcast is, nothing like that. So you get this mix of the simplicity of people telling original stories, but you also get high production values with music and interviews, and all put together in very, very creative ways. I think podcasting is going to just create an incredible array of stories as they're already happening. I do think you're going to end up kind of with two levels. You're going to have this sort of glut of people putting stuff out on their own that get very little listenership, but still enable voices to be heard. Excuse me. And then you're going to get these big production value studio things, of which I think, like TV streaming is sort of culling. There's a, it's sort of retreating because of the cost. I think you'll see that with podcasting, but I'm very excited about it.
Do you think maybe you can mention when you have a chance to get a drink of water, which is always a scary thing when I'm on your shows, either the dog is barking, the neighbor has the blower going, or the cat is crawling up my leg, and I'm trying to maintain composure as I'm on the radio. But do you think, you talk a little bit about the people in the back, Larry, the lot of because I've had a chance to talk with some of them, and your producers and your interns and so forth, that sort of the structure that you have in the show and how they help you gather the information. Oh, you're on mute. Cheryl, can you unmute Larry? Is he muted?
I don't even, he disappeared from my screen.
He did? Nope.
I think he froze.
There, I did it. It said I couldn't do it, that the host needed to unmute me.
Okay.
So, and then I got a pop-up that said I could unmute.
It was the cough button.
So finally let me do it, but I'm sorry, what were you asking again?
So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the folks in the back, who you've got your producers and you've got your interns and sort of the next generation. I'm sure that they absolutely adore you and are just in such admiration. This guy often have conversations. They usually ask me what I had for breakfast, which I guess is a way of hearing if my voice is okay. But it's just they just are just very, very much in admiration of you. And maybe you can describe a little bit about how you put a show together and your folks that help support you.
Well, that's nice to hear. We're a very tight group, and I admire them. What we have are 4 producers. They're led by a senior producer, Matt D'Angelantonio, and the 4 of them all book segments under Matt's direction. We have 2 meetings a day before the show and after the show, where we go through and determine what segments we're going to do. We hash out who the best guests we think are, and the producers go and book those. We have 2 news apprentices, and those are people that are typically recent college graduates, and this is their first paid job in radio. It's a chance for them over the year-long period of the News Apprentice program to learn by doing what a show like this is like. We typically have 2 of them at a time on the program, and they're huge contributors to the program. One of the news apprentices actually puts together all the study material that I use the night before and the morning of for the segments that we're doing. That's her job. Another news apprentice is the one who handles all the organizational details on our Film Week program. So that news apprentice is putting together the list of films for the week, making sure that I have pronouncers for the different actors and directors, so I know how to correctly pronounce their names. They do that for me. And then we often have an intern who's a current college student who is observing and able to do some things, but much of it is just spending a few hours a week being just a part of the team and really learning what goes into it. But it's very much a team effort. All of the producers, everybody on our staff, was born after AirTalk started, which blows my mind. All of their parents, I confirmed this with them, every parent of member of our staff is younger than me. So it's wonderful for me because I have great respect for them and I learn so much from them. It helps keep me in touch with what's happening in popular culture. Now, I'm nowhere near at their level on popular culture. I wouldn't pretend to be, but I'm so much better than I would be otherwise because of my exposure to them. So they translate stuff for me. They explain why this person is a major figure in millennial or Gen Z. It's extremely helpful. They even share their worldview. And we were talking, for example, in one of our meetings the other day, and we use broad strokes to try and get at larger issues. So I'm going to we oversimplify things, and we don't judge each other for it because we understand we have a more nuanced view. But I was saying, it seems to me like looking at this survey information that Gen Zers, everybody wants to have a job where they change the world. No one just wants to, wait tables and do, make a burrito. That's important. I was saying, this helping other people live their lives, checking people out at the supermarket, bagging groceries, stocking shelves. These are important jobs. And it seems like among Gen Z, none of you you don't see this as important. You all want to change the world. I said, I'm a boomer. I think for many of us, we take value, whatever it is, the person that's, building the house, the person that's, those are important contributions. They don't have to be solving the climate crisis. And they laughed and said, yeah, we do see that, in our generation. And it was fun because it was it was sort of getting at that issue. And they went into greater detail about some of the reasons why they think that younger people do have this view that they've got to have a job that's going to save the world or change the world, and why that's different for people in my generation. And it was very enlightening for me. I really learned from them. So it's incredibly valuable to me, and I feel so fortunate to be able to work with them. And they're super smart.
Yeah, no, they really are. And just as sort of a little peek behind the scenes is that usually when we're asked to do a segment, we have a little bit of a hint of what the topic is going to be. So you can kind of do a last minute brush up on the behavior of T cells in the setting of COVID or something, if that article has been caught up. So I would be remiss, Larry, if I didn't recognize your expertise as a film reviewer and your love of cinema. And can you comment a little bit about how that piece fits into your career?
Well, I've always loved movies, and one of the nice things about growing up in Hollywood is on my walk home on Hollywood Boulevard, I would walk by all these movie theaters, and unlike neighborhood movie theaters, which typically were only open at night, in Hollywood, they were open all afternoon. You could go and see a movie anytime. So I would often, if I had a free afternoon and didn't have to write a paper or read a bunch of chapters, I'd stop in and see a movie. And I read movie reviews from probably middle school. So I paid attention to critics. I wanted to go see movies that people said had something to say or were interesting. And so I remember, for example, when Chinatown came out in the early 70s, and I went to see it. I think it was like the second day it was out. I'd read about it. And I don't think I was even old enough to go see it. It was rated R, but they let me in. So I went and saw Chinatown, and I came home and told my parents, you've got to see this movie. It's incredible. Look at historic Los Angeles and the acting and the music, everything was just, and so that was kind of how I felt about movies. And after I started AirTalk, I think it was about year 2, the publicist for the LA Weekly approached me and said, we have this incredible team of film reviewers. Would you be interested in doing a weekly show with our film critics, a part of AirTalk? And I said, well, I'd love to do a film review. That's a wonderful idea, but I don't want to just use LA Weekly film critics. We'll include yours, but I want to use LA Times and other publications. So we started as a segment, Film Talk, as a segment of AirTalk. And that ran for a number of years. And then we transitioned to break it out as its own hour-long program, Film Week. And that's how that went. We have a team now of 10 critics that we rotate, because they have to see on the weeks they're doing Film Week, like they may see 12 movies in that week. Well, you can't ask someone to do that every week. They're not doing that for their publications. So we rotate it, and then they take on that huge task for that week and see all those films. Most of them aren't any good. So we're asking them to do a lot. They're seeing bad movies so you don't have to. And that's a tremendous service. But I love doing Film Week. And the relationship that I have with the critics is great. So many of them have been on our show for 20 years. You know, I've known these people. We've all, you know, gotten older together, and it's you know, I've seen them go from job to job in many cases, be in some difficult circumstances because of the contraction of journalism. But you know, they're very, very important people to me, as well as beloved colleagues. I love doing Film Week. And every year we do our Oscar preview show. This year it's at the Orpheum Theater in downtown Los Angeles. It's going to be Sunday afternoon, March 5th, a week before the Oscars. So if you can get tickets and come, that would be great. LAist.com/events has tickets for it, but it's really fun. All our critics on stage. We show clips from the Best Picture nominees. We take the major categories. It's really, really fun. And our critics, because they're all together, are funny and they play off each other. It's a dynamic show. It's our 21st annual show this year. So it's built a following. It's really nice.
That's amazing. Well, I think in just a couple of them, we'll take a few questions here, but I know the other great love of your life, besides your family and your career, is this city that we live in, because you're such an expert on Los Angeles and Pasadena. Tell us some of your impressions of growing up in LA and how that's influenced who you are and what your experience has been in radio because of that.
Dr. Schreiner, it's my upbringing, but also that of my grandparents, my parents, and great-grandparents. My great-grandfather came to Los Angeles with his wife right around the turn of the century. Went to work for Pacific Telephone Company. He climbed telephone poles, turned down every promotion the Pacific Telephone offered him because he only wanted to work outdoors with no pressure of managing everybody. He retired as a telephone lineman at age 65, still climbing telephone poles, a year older than I am now. I can't imagine climbing telephone poles at my age. And he had a bit of a physical disability. One leg was shorter than the other because of a childhood accident, and they didn't have any of the safety gear like they have today. And he went up and down poles all day long. He was still painting his own house in South LA near Florence and Normandy when he was nearly 90 years old. That's the kind of hardy person he was. So he lived until I was out of college. He lived to be 97. So I heard all his stories about being out in all these neighborhoods of Los Angeles, what they were like. My grandfather, who was a physician with 2 offices in Los Angeles, was raised in LA, born and raised there. And so I heard all his stories. My parents are both native Angelenos. So I have a sense of the history essentially throughout the 20th century. And hearing about the change, I'm so sorry. Sorry, I've been talking all day. Too much. Hearing about all those stories, coupled with my experience growing up in Inglewood and then in Hollywood, really has given me a sense of all the change, how we've gone from a city that in the early 20th century was really dominated by the group that the historian Kevin Starr calls the folks. Those are like my great-grandparents who came to Southern California from the Midwest. My great-grandfather came from Michigan. He was a farm boy and came for economic opportunity. Those people really dominated in the early part of the 20th century. And then it was after that, after World War II, of course, we saw so many more people come and the rise of Latino immigration. Some of that during the time, early 20th century, time of the Mexican Civil War. That's when my wife's family came to Los Angeles. Her father was born in LA, as was his father. So my wife, who's Latina, multi-generation, But so you had that group of Mexicans that came at that time in the era of Pancho Villa. And then, of course, we had the much later migration of Mexicans to Southern California that have built the population here so much since. So I love that our region is the home to all these second largest populations of people from around the world. I love that I hear all these different languages and, Spanglish and other, mixes of English and other languages. I did a segment a few months ago, and it was precipitated. There were some guys that were working on our house, and they were out having a cigarette on the deck in the backyard, and they were talking, and they were going between Armenian and English. In the middle of the sentence, they'd drop in an English word, or they'd say a sentence in English and drop in an Armenian word. And it gave them the idea, we should do a segment, ask people who are multilingual, what are things that you will say usually in English because that's the better option to describe the thing? Or what will you say in your other language because that's the better option? The phones blew up. We just had so many listeners with so many examples. Oh, here's a word that we have in Arabic that there's no good English translation for. So I may be talking with my friend who's from Syria, and so we'll be speaking English because that's most of what we speak, but then we'll drop in the Arabic word because there is no word that's, Anyway, it was so much fun, and the languages that people knew that they shared, I totally dig that about LA. It's so much fun for me. We raised a biracial son, whose girlfriend is biracial, and his best friends in school are biracial of all different mixes. They have two mothers, two fathers. I love it. It's really, to me, a place that brings so many different people and their experiences together. And as long as we talk together, as long as we share our worlds with each other, I think we're going to be okay.
Well said. Thank you. Thank you so much, Larry. I'll let you have a drink of water before we get to just a couple questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to take questions. My apologies over
no worries. I know the feeling. It's just a remarkable career that you have and continue to have, and the work that you do is so important and interesting and stimulating for everybody. So, and you're just very, very articulate and eloquent. So thank you again for taking the time to do this. Let me get to a couple of the questions. One of the questions was, what's the connection between KPCC and Pasadena City College and the AirTalk show?
Right. Well, Pasadena City College started the station as KPCS. It stood for Pasadena City Schools, which actually I shouldn't say it was Pasadena City College. It was all one. At the time that it started in the early 1950s, I think it was 1950 or 51, once the educational band, the left side of the FM dial, as we used to call it when it was actually a visual band that way before it was digital. Pasadena Schools, which controlled PCC, started a radio station as a sort of a workshop for students. When Pasadena City College split off and the community college district was created, which runs PCC, the radio station went with that. And it changed its call letters from KPCS to KPCC for Pasadena City College. And so everyone who worked at the radio station, was a tiny staff, 5 people, which was the minimum we could have to get our Corporation for Public Radio grant. They wouldn't give you a grant if the institution operating the station wasn't willing to fund 5 full-time employees. So PCC, when it joined NPR, when it went to a full-time radio station, not just a student station, had 5 different people. Our general manager was also a professor and later a dean of the college. And then you had these 5 full-timers, and the rest was supplemented with students and community volunteers. And it operated that way for a number of years. That was the KPCC that I walked in the door with in late 79, early 1980. And it operated that way for a number of years. The transmitter was even on the top of the administration building of the college, and we only served the San Gabriel Valley, part of North Orange County, and central Los Angeles. We didn't hit West LA. You couldn't really get us much in Hollywood unless you were in the hills, because the transmitter was so low. We moved the transmitter to Mount Wilson, making the station, much wider signal area. But the challenges of the college operating the station became clear. It became very financially difficult for the college to fund KPCC when its priority was on educating students. And the college came to the determination that, we really shouldn't be in the radio business, but we don't want to give up the radio station. It's a valuable asset. It enables PCC to be talked about, and we want the station to stay within the Pasadena area community college district, not to move to downtown LA or Hollywood or something. So they opened up requests for proposals for entities to lease the signal. And so different organizations like C-SPAN was a bidder, there were some others, but Minnesota Public Radio thought this is a great opportunity to show how an independent local community entity can effectively operate a public radio station, and to actually do that in a way that's more effective than a higher educational institution. And so Minnesota Public Radio cultivated Southern Californians who were willing to take on this challenge, and the nonprofit Southern California Public Radio was created. Minnesota Public Radio helped with the establishment of that, but SCPR really had the control through its local board of this new entity that now operated 89.3 KPCC. So the college entered into a long-term lease, which has since been renewed, I believe, twice, enabling SCPR to operate KPCC. So PCC doesn't have any sort of editorial control. You'll hear the announcements promoting the college and the great work that they're doing at the top of every hour. That's part of our contract with the college. The call letters KPCC state, that is our identifier under the Federal Communications Commission. So every hour you'll hear that KPCC Pasadena identifier. That's still our city of license. And our studios are in Pasadena. We cannot move them, nor would we, we could go anywhere in the community college district like La Cañada or Arcadia, but only within the college district. That's part of the contract with PCC. So I hope that explains it.
Excellent. There's been several questions that if you could talk a little bit about what you think in your experience actually changes people's point of view. What is it, fact, or is it some of the emotional and powerful things that the listeners, when they tell their own personal stories? What do you think is there a balance there? What do you think is the most impactful? There's a lot of theatrics in media now, and sort of unconscious and conscious bias, of course, we know. So what do you think is the most powerful sort of factor in getting people to understand and change their point of view, or if they can change their point of view?
I think people have to be open to it. I really do. In my experience, if someone's not open to taking input and changing a point of view, it's just so much easier to settle on a point of view and not be swayed by anything. It's so emotionally comforting to people to fix on a particular view that I'm not convinced that that person is really persuadable. I think that either they have to have something jarring happen to them personally. This happened, I think, with many people, going back to HIV/AIDS, when people had their kids who were gay contracting HIV and caring about loving their kids, even though they might have been very judgmental about being gay, that's something that would have the power to change someone. And not everyone was changed by that. There were parents who still rejected their kids tragically. But So it has to be something either very personal like that, or there has to be some degree of openness. So I think there are degrees of openness for the person who has left the door open a crack. I think what is convincing is that they hear something they've truly never heard before. They hear an argument that's novel. They hear an experience that's something they never thought really was something that would be a human experience, and then they put themselves in the place of that person. So I see my job as to try and dig deeper, to go to the arguments that people haven't really heard before, that and people's personal accounts that maybe in the listener's world they would have never experienced, but now they're hearing someone who, because of their background, because of what they went through, can describe it in a way that gets to us, that affects us, so that we can see ourselves in the place of that person. I think that's what brings about change. But if someone is really dead set, as we saw with HIV/AIDS and rejection of people's own kids, there's not a lot you can do with someone who's just closed.
It's fascinating. You know, just to sort of bring this full circle, our project, of course, is focused in Tanzania. And happily, I will say that radio is still a very important part of spreading information and news, hopefully, and facts to people, even in remote areas. Everybody has a cell phone in Tanzania. You're out in the Serengeti, and there's a hurting person with the cell phone on their ear. So, so I think you can broaden your audience even to some of those areas, Larry, because it's a very powerful medium. I want to thank you on behalf of our organization and on all the people that joined tonight. It just was a pleasure. It's just a treat to know you and to work with AirTalk. I really enjoy doing it. It's a lot of fun, and I just thank everybody for attending tonight, and we hope that we can get you back sometime.
I would just love to close, Dr. Schreiner, by saying again how much I appreciate your willingness to give all your time to come on AirTalk for all these years to talk about COVID-19. I appreciate all the work that you do here in our Pasadena community and the work that you're doing in Tanzania. It's just incredibly meaningful, and we so appreciate. I mean, this exemplifies the kinds of things that we need to do, the concern for what's happening in our backyard, but also globally, to try and provide resources to places where there's great need and where we can do that and work with people in those communities. And I also want to thank everyone who came this evening to hear Dr. Schreiner and me talk. The support that you're giving to this is deeply meaningful. So I thank you just as a local resident who cares about the work of this project and appreciates you providing the support that it needs. So thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be a part of this. I've been honored to do this.
Asante sana. Thank you very much, Larry. Just really super. So we'll let everybody enjoy their evening and let Larry, I hope you have a nice hot toddy waiting for you.
I will have a little warm beverage. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you all for coming.